we're just about ready to roll. So welcome everybody. Apologies from Stephen, my co-chair. And we're addressing, I think, a subject that the group hasn't really looked at in great detail before. But it is of considerable interest, I think, to many of us. And it's strangely enough, it's the second meeting today about healthcare and technology. The first that I went to this morning, where Natalie was also present and on the panel, was about the application of technology, particularly satellite technology, to healthcare. And in many respects, quite a bit of the narrative was a little bit depressing because of the ability or the capability or the willingness of our own NHS to pick up on new technology. So I think that's very much the backdrop to some of this, and I was quite struck by what David Lord Willits had to say as well. He said, if you have a business plan, don't necessarily include making a sale to the NHS in it. Which I thought was quite graphic, which means that he said you can, go think of the German healthcare system or the French healthcare system or the US regulators, you'll find them all a lot more user-friendly. So I thought, well, heavens, that's not a very good way of actually encouraging tech in healthcare in our own country. So I'm going to be extremely interested to hear about not only the applications, but also about the context in which the AI solutions in healthcare are being discussed this evening. Because I think, it's all very well for us to talk about and get excited about the potential for technology, but if we're not picking it up and running with it and applying it within our own health service, well, I think that's a matter of huge regret, and we need solutions. We need to find ways of getting through to NHS England, the transformation directorate, which has been relatively recently formed within the NHS and was the subject of the Health and Care Bill in many ways, especially with the creation of the new integrated care boards and so on and so forth. So there is an intention there, but whether it's really going to be delivered, I don't know. And of course, Lord Holmes, as ever, was ever present. He was at the meeting this morning. So Chris, you may want to comment as to whether you feel any more optimistic at the end of this meeting versus the previous one. So, over to you a bit later, perhaps. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Dom Cushnan, who is the Director of AI, Imaging and Development, NHS AI Lab. So who better to start off with than somebody who is intimately involved with the development of AI in the NHS? This way.
That's fine.
Great.
I've had one of those days as well.
I always have one.
Well, definitely no need for pressure then for me to answer all these questions and be optimistic. I'm hoping that through kind of the first few minutes as I introduce the work and in Q&A, we'll spend some time kind of covering more use cases. So first off, yes, I'm Dominic Cushnan. I'm the Director of AI, Imaging and Deployment. I'm 6 months into the role as I oversee a programme of work that is a joint unit between the Department of Health and Social Care and NHS England inside the department, the team that you recognise as the Transformation Directorate. The NHS AI Lab, for those of you who are familiar with it and those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is primarily set up to support health and care organisations really come together to understand how they both develop the technology safely and effectively. We've obviously got the ethical debates that we need to have around how we use these technologies, and then also how do we think about deployment. And we work with over 100 different types of technologies, 77 of them being used today, and I'll talk about those in more detail as we go through Q&A. What we do know is that most of these technologies that we're testing are very much still in the research and development stage, although there is many promising areas of uses of technologies where we can see some real benefit to clinicians. That's specifically in diagnostics, and that's what I'm really excited to share today. We know that we have a number of challenges ahead of us not just outside of the pandemic that's hit us all, but also how do we support our diagnostic workforce, and how do we support innovators to really get to that point of being able to operationalize the technologies that they spent some time developing to get them integrated and deployed into the clinical pathways. The work that we build on is off ongoing work that we've got with the National Data Strategy and the Data Saves Lives programme. And that really helps us kind of understand where the commitment of the programme is, and we'll spend some time, I'm sure, talking about infrastructural needs, the size of data sets, the ways we commercialise, the way that we actually buy these technologies, and do we actually know how the workforce really respond to the confidence of using these technologies. And we'll spend some time talking a little bit more about that through tonight's sessions. We've just published a new report specifically on that piece, because one of the challenges that we've had is lots of people are very enthusiastic on the innovator side around using technology, but there's a lot of naysayers, is that the appropriate word to use, of clinical staff that really want to be able to be inspired to use the technology, but they need some confidence around how they use that. So in partnership with Health Education England, we've completed the second report on how we will think about how we train the workforce to use these data-driven technologies to provide them the confidence that these technologies are appropriate for their use in day-to-day work, and they can actually ask some of the questions around sensitivity, specificity, etc. I think my big ask for today is that we continue thinking about how we build the infrastructure and how we end up thinking about how we can get these technologies safely at scale within our healthcare system, and we provide the mechanisms for both infrastructure but also the assurances that these technologies can be used at scale, whether it's in an integrated care system or at scale for the entire National Health Service. And then, without a shadow of a doubt, making sure that we're upskilling the workforce that are going to be using these technologies.
So, just a minor number of barriers to implementation, basically, Don. And I just wanted to raise one of the key issues, because you've raised quite a number of things which no doubt will come up. I mean, the data set issue, I think, is one that in the past has not been handled that well. Sure. And we hope that the new governance arrangements for NHS data, now that NHS Digital is moving across to NHS England, but with some fairly clear new regulation and so on and so forth, is going to make a difference. But it's the skills, it's the understanding of the potential of new technology and how to apply it, which is one of the key issues, I suspect, for the NHS currently, which, you know, because if you're not careful, it creates a kind of technology aversion. And so how are you going particularly to get through that skills issue? Because, I mean, it's, you know, it's a huge, huge question, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if I can frame the question, which is, we've spent a lot of time focused on the research side of machine learning and how we think about machine learning and what it can be applied to. I think we're at that point in time now where we should be, hence the new word in my job title, which is around deployment. How do we think about the deployment of these technologies? And some of it is definitely the technical capabilities around how do we integrate these technologies into the existing systems, and then how do we make sure that we've actually got some time and space for the clinical, not just clinical, but also the management teams that are looking to use these technologies inside their organisations, so they've got either the headspace or the support to make sure that they're filling in the right DPIAs, the IG is compliant, and that they're figuring out the right commercial ways of buying these technologies. And then also, how do we make sure that we've got the right mechanisms to actually buy the actual technology rather than just continually doing more and more research. I think one of my first experiences in the NHS was there's more pilots in the NHS than British Airways. And I think one of the things that we really need to think about is we're really, really good, I think, as a country at supporting research and development, and we definitely should continue doing more of that. We've got mechanisms to generate those large data sets for the training and development of it. However, I'll probably speak for many innovators that I've engaged with just inside our NHS AI award programme. The challenge is the next step. How do we get it to that next level of integration for large-scale deployment, which goes back to what you said about Lord.
Yes, and you know, it's you and whose army, basically.
Exactly.
I mean, you know, the question is what resource do you have to deliver? But no doubt we will be exploring that, and I hope people will store up their questions, because I suspect there are a number of people who have aspirations to deal with the NHS.
Think there'll be more questions.
So I think you'll get a few questions later on. That's terrific. Okay, now I hope I'm looking in the right direction, but you can never tell. We're over to now Dr. Keith Grimes, who's the Medical Director of Babylon Health.
Thank Thank you very much, and hello everyone. My name's Keith Grimes. I'm an NHS-trained general practitioner, still doing some general practice as well, but several years ago moved lock stock into the world of digital health, and this is where I spend my time now. So for those who don't know Babylon, Babylon's a global health technology company. We focus on delivering digital-first primary care, or digital-first health services, both here in the UK, US, and Rwanda, in total about 15 countries around the world. So in the UK, you might be aware of what we do with GP at Hand, which is an NHS general practice that is digital-first with over 100,000 patients. And in the last year, we've served 1 million consultations, both with that, but also with our private services here in the UK. And in the US, we're over 250,000 members working with our value-based care offering across there as well. So we've got quite a lot of experience in delivering the clinical services. So my job actually at Babylon is more specifically Director of Clinical Product Management, Digital Health and Innovation. And that's quite a mouthful, but in short, my job is specifically to try and understand the healthcare system and the healthcare market, and principally the problems that patients and clinicians face, and as a product manager try to identify, design, build, deploy, and assure the solutions out there as well. So I'm very much about trying to find practical solutions out there. And my experience in Babylon is working in AI services, so I'm particularly interested in the experience of taking AI products and services and actually getting them into operation, which is the important challenge, as we've heard from Dom, about how we do this. So what does that involve for me? That involves building risk prediction models, which we use to help identify the likelihood of certain outcomes in our patients, to be able to intervene in a timely manner, or decision support for patients and clinicians as well, to help them understand what next steps they might want to take as well. And today there's just 3 broad areas that I wanted to discuss, if that was okay. First of all was the increasing adoption of health. How can we increase the adoption of AI in healthcare where it's appropriate to do so? A little bit on pandemic preparedness and the availability of open data, and then if there's a little bit at the end to talk about the promise, but also the challenge of some of the newer technologies such as large language models as well. So just to start out as well, in terms of increasing the adoption of artificial intelligence, the critical importance here is about the clinician workforce, or the healthcare professional workforce, and making sure that they're both ready to bring AI into their workplace, but also trust it. And that involves design, building, and testing it, but also using it. And when I joined Babylon back in 2018, one of the problems that we faced was the lack of appropriately trained staff and skilled professionals working into this space. It's something that I was fortunate enough to work on the Topol review in 2019, which actually highlighted this and made some recommendations about how we can train the workforce of the future. So we helped use that to inform what we did internally within Babylon. We built a digital health curriculum and a digital health guild of clinicians working with the product teams to be able to build the technology. And as a result of this, I'm really delighted to see what HE brought out with the Healthcare Workers' Confidence in AI paper as well. Interestingly, one of the authors, Annabelle Painter, was a former Babylon doctor as well, and Dom, of course, was involved in it too. Throughout this, and it's well worth a read, the recommendations are fantastic, but in particular, I'd like to support the recommendations made about training the next generation of these digital healthcare workers, particularly as they break down into what they describe as shapers, those people that are help shaping the direction of what we're going, drivers, those people that champion the use of these technologies, the creators, those people that are building the technology, embedders, those people who are finding ways to use it in practice, and then ultimately the end users as well. And within the report, they also talk about the importance of good governance and then developing trust, because without trust, it's very, very difficult to get anyone using these technologies as well. So inside Babylon, part of the work that I do is making sure that we comply with all the applicable regional, international safety and regulatory privacy and security standards to try and stay abreast of the developments here and around the world. But it's complicated stuff. Things are moving really, really quickly as well. Like we've got people here from some of the regulatory bodies here in the UK too. So internally, what we try to develop is a digital health governance framework to allow us to consider holistically changes in this particular area. And we've also developed an internal ethics forum which allows us to consider how we use our technologies as well, trying to bring a sort of not just the clinicians in, but all the other members of staff within the company as well to have their say on this. Now, we need to be able to make sure that we work with regulators, because things do move very, very fast. And we need to make sure that the regulation ensures safety, but enabling this iterative approach. One of the key features of artificial intelligence, of course, is that it learns and develops as well. And that involves a certain pace too, something that the regulatory frameworks are starting to deal with as well. So we'd very much like to continue working with regulators, both us at Babylon and also within the industry, to sort of identify what particular challenges there are with artificial intelligence. when it comes to being used as a device in medical care. And maybe to start looking at some of the approaches, like, for example, the United States under the FDA with the self-certification programs, which allow the regulators to certify the processes within the organizations themselves to allow them to do appropriate level certification, to allow that pace to continue and allow us to make the best use of these technologies. And then in terms of pandemic preparedness, when we're provided with high quality data in real time, it's incredible what we can do. And I think some of the examples of this through the pandemic, we saw some great use of analytical technologies and artificial intelligence in helping in our response here and around the world. But within Babylon, we have to use data scientists, epidemiologists, and population health experts to make sure we make the best use of this, but also we use explainable or white box artificial intelligence. And this is really important. This is the dependency that I want to underline, is that all these technologies are only as strong as the data that is provided to them as well. We continue to face the challenge of COVID now. We will undoubtedly face novel infections and other public health challenges in the future. And this is going to mean that we're going to need access to large data and sensitive data. And the public, again, need to trust that we in the public sector, private sector, academia, and so on, will respect and ensure this privacy and security continues. So from an industry perspective, we try and include privacy and security by design from the start. But it's also important to use some of the new technologies as well. And some of those new technologies, including cryptographic techniques to make sure that we maintain anonymity while we're training these models. We use differential privacy or either train AI models to create synthetic models, which allow us to, or synthetic data, which allow us to develop new models. Federated learning, where models are trained piecemeal to make sure that things can't get aggregated in one place and increase the security, or trying to combine them all. And so our request really is that the government continues to support making these high quality data securely available to all those working in the sector, and encourage the use of best practice to maintain anonymity. And in that way, we can maintain public trust, because this is all about trust and making sure that people are comfortable that the technology is working for them. And then finally, very briefly, artificial intelligence, as I said, moves very fast. And then latterly, we've seen the growth of what are called large language models, extremely capable models developed by, which can be fine-tuned to provide services in either small areas. Now, the pace of change here is very, very rapid, but one of the challenges here is about explainability and interpretability. These are using technologies that are by their nature very hard to explain and understand. Now, whilst technology is being developed to increase the explainability here, we do face a point where we have to consider that some of the technologies that we have may prove extremely useful and extremely valuable and extremely effective in real world use, but we may be limited in our ability to explain why it is working that way. Now, while we try and balance this, I'd also encourage that we really engage with this as well and consider the pros and cons of using these incredibly powerful technologies in healthcare and other areas as well, because this is something that's being discussed globally as to where you'll be able to apply this. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. Just following up briefly, you obviously work on an international scale. How does the UK compare in terms of access to data sets and the general kind of regulatory regime? How does that compare to other jurisdictions that you operate in?
Well, there are strengths and weaknesses in how the UK compares. I'd say some of the things that work very well inside the United Kingdom is that thanks to the National Health Service and actually how we configure our services, we've got very large amounts of data of really quite high quality. You know, a cradle-to-grave approach means a cradle-to-grave data record as well. So in theory, we should actually have quite a strong advantage in this particular country, or in this country, to be able to do that. The trouble is that this data is not connected together. It's in a lot of different forms in different places as well, and that hampers our ability to be able to make the most of this particular resource, either within the NHS or with industry or academia working with that as well. So we've got a great resource, but there's work to do to free that up as well. Now, in terms of the regulatory side of things, I'm aware I've got one of my regulatory colleagues next to me as well. It's extremely high quality. You know, it's very thorough as well, but it moves at a pace that sometimes means that as we develop new technologies, it's hard to keep up. And of course, new technologies develop, and the regulators working in association with us will then have to change the regulation, but then the technology changes, and there's this sort of constant move. So in the United Kingdom, as compared to the United States, for example, the United States has got some exemptions in this area to allow this to move a little bit more faster. And there's also, as I mentioned earlier on, the self-certification program, which is put through as a pilot, at least one pilot in the US that I'm aware of there as well. And so whilst that's not signed into place, there are some ways forward.
Great, thanks very much. And of course, I had assumed that the MHRA was the main regulator that you dealt with rather than the BSI, but that's...
Well, apologize, the BSI is a notified body on this particular case,
Yeah. Good, okay, thank you very much. And then we're on to Natalie Pankova. Natalie, Chief Operating Officer of Cube Labs.
Thank you very much. So thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. The perspective that I'll give tonight is from an innovator, so companies that are developing diagnostic and clinical decision support technologies using AI, which is what I've been doing with companies for over the last decade or so. And primarily, my evidence portion will address the questions around how effective and efficient is AI in actually being able to analyze these large quantities of data, and really an innovator's perspective around the health data governance component as well. So first, I just want to clarify that when we're talking about diagnostics, which is what this panel is really about, the AI is really good at doing a couple of things quite well, which is the ability to classify, so whether a patient is falling into a certain category, not another, and the ability to predict, so whether a patient has some chance of some event happening at some future point in time. And we now do have evidence that AI can do this much better than a clinician in certain instances, taking these large quantities of data and information simultaneously, which is becoming really, really challenging for clinicians to do with a lot of information coming out there now constantly, and constant new evidence generation in the clinical sphere. And so there was an article published, I believe some of the work that Babylon has done at the end of 2020 as well, that says that an algorithm can be really developed that is better at diagnosing disease accurately than human doctors when you take together a sample set of realistic case studies. So this evidence is out there. And there is a technology that I also helped develop and deploy into NHS primary care with a company called MedAdvice, of which I was Chief Operating Officer. And essentially, we have shown that we can use algorithms to better manage complex, chronic, and multi-morbid conditions, where decisions about patients are really, really difficult, and really leaves doctors at a point that can lead to inaction, this kind of wait-and-see approach or a trial-and-error approach, which of course we don't want. It leads to poor patient outcomes. And this AI is now being used in both research and practice across tens of thousands of patient records to identify, for example, cohorts of non-responders to certain therapies, such as statins, or cohorts of patients who should be accelerated much more rapidly and will benefit from more aggressive treatments sooner. And this manuscript is actually in publication at the moment. Now, the challenges that we face in this process were really not around how good the AI or the algorithms or the technology itself was at handling data, but rather it was infrastructural challenges of getting access to the right data, getting access to clinical capacity, inefficient or ineffective AI literacy at multiple levels of healthcare organizations, and really low availability of funding for the healthcare organizations themselves to actually implement and spread this technology, which led a lot of the burden being placed on the innovators themselves in order to be able to do this and effectively spread this. Second example I will provide is the AI that I'm currently helping develop at a company called Novi. This is a diagnostic imaging AI for ophthalmology. This is a really well-established area of AI utility now with medical imaging. Novi's technology is successfully used for research purposes across pharmaceutical clinical trials, and at the moment is being developed for deployment into clinical practice. And really, we're going outside the UK first because it is so challenging to be able to deploy these kinds of clinical solutions in the UK. We have shown that it is possible to run thousands of images through these algorithms and successfully pick up classifiers and predictors of disease in the eye. And the algorithms do become more efficient with increased quantities of data that they get access to and process. But the thing is, the algorithms, they don't just get access to good quality data on their own. So we have to make that data available to them. And so it is up to organizations from both the innovator side and the clinical side to be able to ensure that the infrastructure is either provided or developed if it needs to be, to make sure that these inputs are efficient. And so data acquisition, data access, data processing, and data modeling pipelines should be built in this manner. Notably, when Google Health tried to do this in Thailand to deploy their real-world algorithms, actually resulted in quite poor clinical effectiveness because their algorithms were built on data that was just too good and not real-world. So these things do happen. So it has to be built with clinical utility and usability in mind. And so finally, to touch on the perspective around health data governance, if we're really saying that AI is only as good as the data and the training information that is provided to it, it means that data is as equally or even maybe more important than the actual algorithms and the computing power themselves. And while AI models and computing power is now cheap, accessible, democratized, the data is not. It usually comes with a heavy price tag. So for example, if you're going through CPRD or HDR UK, you've got to pay for this data oftentimes, and where the data sets are not available already, there is time and effort required to be able to curate these data sets from scratch. And this is a significant burden on healthcare innovators as well. And so our experience across several clinics and trusts is that this is about 12 to 24 months of effort required in order to actually get access to these kinds of data sets. This puts barrier on quality and efficiency of actually developing these technologies. And so protracted data access experience can actually deter financial incentives away from building these kinds of innovations. And so I think there are learnings that we can take away from these experiences, and there are projects now across the world, across Europe, for example, Data Lake medical data donation system in Poland that's now being built for the donation of data in the same way that patients would be donating organs or blood, for instance, that the UK regulators can look at in order to expand how they build their own data sharing and governance models. So looking forward to discussing further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure Dom has been listening very carefully to that. And are you effectively telling us that Poland is much easier to deal with in terms of piloting your products, or even just simply selling the products and having them applied? Natalie, is that right?
I think there are learnings to be taken away, and there are systems that are more innovative in terms of getting access to data or encouraging data pools to be built that will allow access for these kinds of systems to be built in the future. These are new initiatives. These are, of course, new technologies that are being built, so these things are constantly changing. And I think we have to be really well aware of everything that's going on in other countries across the globe to ensure that we're using the best practices from both a privacy, security, ethics perspective, but also from the business case perspective, and allowing innovation to expand across the healthcare system.
Just probing that a little bit about standards of comparison. I mean, your technology has global application, and I suspect, particularly in developing countries, if their data sets are good enough or your access to the data is good enough. I mean, is that do you currently work in the developing world?
So at the moment, no, but I have with other companies before, and I can tell you that there are certain cases where there isn't existing infrastructure or incumbent infrastructure in place that actually does allow data access, easier data access, because you don't have to deal with middlemen organizations such as electronic medical records that keep their claws on all the data essentially, and data access does become easier.
Yeah, very interesting. So you have to pick your market
Yes.
quite carefully, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Now on to Michael Bridges, who's the Senior Vice President Data Science at Optum.
Thank you very much. It's so Optum, which is actually part of United Health Group. It's a large healthcare organization based in the US, but we do operate globally, and we have a big footprint, obviously, locally in the UK. Myself, I've been at Optum for about 5 years. Prior to that, I worked in algorithmic research. And at Optum, I lead a team of data scientists, of clinicians, of data engineers, and we design and build and deploy AI algorithms for use predominantly in the US, a large market there, over 100 million patients and lives that we treat and we have access to. We also operate in other global locations, including the UK. And these algorithms center on large-scale risk prediction, for example, disease prediction algorithms, identifying early stages of chronic disease, and recommending, crucially, appropriate interventions to the right patient at the right time. And so in the few moments available to me just to, at the start here, I just wanted to explore three kind of key topics. The first is, and we've heard a lot about some of the amazing new advances in AI and image recognition and diagnosis and advanced analytics, but there are some very practical ways that AI is already making an impact in the healthcare system. And I'm going to talk through some of the examples that we've got within our United Health Group portfolio, both in the UK, but predominantly globally. I'm also going to talk a little bit about our approach to the safe and responsible use of AI, crucially important in the healthcare domain. And finally, I will close with some thoughts around the governance and the regulation of AI, particularly for policymakers and legislators like yourselves. Okay, so, I mean, as I said, a lot of great examples of huge advancements there from Keith and from Natalie there on some of the latest technologies, and indeed a lot of the newer AI technologies when applied to longitudinal care records and throwing in medical imagery data, you can exceed the performance of a physician in the normal clinical setting. But by and large, our AI focuses on empowering and augmenting human decisions. And we do that in some very tangible ways administratively. For example, 25% of clinicians' time is spent on administrative duties. We can ease the automated processing of clinical documentation, extract, interpret handwritten texts, for example, care coordination, utilization planning, very practical things that can really make a strong impact on the health outcomes of individuals. And a key element, a second piece here, is the engagement of patients. And 50% of patients are just not engaged with their healthcare treatment. So regardless of the efficacy of the algorithm that you've got put in place, getting the patient to be engaged is hugely important to the final outcome. And so we've concentrated a number of AI algorithms around finding the right way to engage that patient, whether that's a telephone call, whether that's a text message, whether they need some personal intervention or someone to visit them at home, to engage them in the treatment, whether it's Alzheimer's treatment, whether it's diabetic treatment, or even control of blood pressure, for example. Knowing the best way to target that patient, hugely important, and using AI to prioritize those channels, we found to be incredibly effective. And of course, we do provide enhanced clinical insight to clinicians and to administrators in the back end. And we've found, for example, in Alzheimer's, we can identify early stages of Alzheimer's and dementia that would sometimes be missed by physicians in the busy workload. And really, these are not necessarily groundbreaking insights. These are things that the clinician might have missed because they hadn't necessarily had time to review the full longitudinal patient record. So it's almost like an aid memoir, a reminder to the physician to check this. It can improve the outcome, for example, and close gaps in care for diabetic treatment, for blood pressure. You can predict, for example, patients that are more likely to have uncontrolled high blood pressure and target them. Tracking infectious diseases post-COVID, incredibly important. And using, for example, longitudinal health records and demographic data combined with anonymized internet search data, you can track the progress of seasonal flu, target individuals for flu vaccines if they're at high risk, or get them to shelter, for example. And a lot of these are just simply not possible with basic analytics. You need AI to make these insights, and so it's an incredibly important development, but again, a very practical one. The second set of points I'd like to make are on the responsible and safe use of AI. And it's something obviously we take incredibly seriously. We believe it's a safe and a credible technology. We take with utmost primacy patient safety and privacy and security. And indeed, Keith has already highlighted some of the areas that, methods now we can use to remediate some of these concerns, like federated data. So the data stays where it is, the algorithm goes to the data. Some very practical things we can do to avoid exposing personal identifiable information about a patient, but still get the insights. Transfer learning, another example. And fairness in AI, again, is something we take very seriously and something we track in all of our deployed AI systems, where we're actively and proactively monitoring to see if some areas of demographics are being negatively affected or targeted by any of our AI algorithms. So there are very practical and tangible things you can do to actually monitor and safely use AI. And so it's really something that now, particularly the initial concern around the black box mechanisms in AI, can largely be remediated through things like explainable AI. And a lot of our physicians, for example, can actually see the outcome from our models. They can monitor with tools like Retain, for example, and explainable AI. They can see why the model decided what it did, and they can decide then how best to use that information. Okay, and finally, I just want to turn my attention to some points for yourselves as policymakers and legislators. And we've talked a lot about some of the hurdles and the regulatory difficulties that we have. And I think one of the things we've seen globally in a number of different jurisdictions is a worryingly broad definition of AI. In some of the recent European Commission publications, for example, very, very broad definitions of AI that are not helpful and are only going to stymie the development and the innovation. We need to be very careful about that. And secondly, as an overarching point, I think the healthcare space is already a highly regulated space. And so we already rely on high degrees of regulatory oversight, peer review, statistical rigor. Those same methods applied lend themselves very well to AI risk calculators, for example. So whether we're examining the difference between, Q-risk or ASCVD and an AI CVD model, very similar and very easy to compare. So we should not be afraid to throw in our AI algorithms into this mix. Okay, so I hope I've highlighted some practical ways that we're using AI globally and in the UK to advance healthcare. Some practical steps that we can use to maintain high standards and deploy this work safely. And I hope also that I've highlighted that very lucky for myself and our company that we're invited to speak today, but obviously more engagement with policymakers and regulators, hugely important, particularly when it concerns precise definitions of AI, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Just a question there, very interesting. You talked about medical ethics and AI ethics and so on. I mean, there's a sort of common approach to medical ethics across the West, by and large, isn't there? Mm-hmm. I mean, are you optimistic that we're going to have a similar approach to AI ethics and regulation across US, UK, EU, indeed, your sort of main Western markets?
We're seeing a convergence, and we're seeing that a lot of the legislation that's appearing in the Justice Department or in the European Commission is moving in the right direction. So there is a layer of kind of control below medical devices where we've got some of these AI algorithms operating, and by and large it seems pretty uniform and fair. I think what we need to be careful about is what algorithms fall into that category. There's a big difference between a logistic regression, a simple analytic, and a deep learning algorithm. But according to some definitions of AI and some acts now, they would fall under the same category and be regulated equivalently. And so the extra burden applied to that would prevent a lot of the deployment that we'd like to see and the ultimate healthcare outcomes that we could have.
Although you could argue that if it's risk-based, then you eliminate some of the problems rather than you can eliminate some of the AI or the software, if you like, that falls into the definition because they're treated as low risk under the European legislation, couldn't you?
So some things could fall through the the gap.
Would not be caught basically because software that happens to fall into the definition because it is treated as low risk would therefore not be caught. Overly caught by regulation.
Yes, so there's a balance here that we need to meet, definitely.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And on to Rob Turpin, the Head of Sector Healthcare BSI. Rob.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. So Rob Turpin, Head of Sector for Healthcare at the British Standards Institution. And I work in the part of the business that's appointed by government as the UK national standards body. You'll probably also be aware that BSI also runs a significant notified body and approved body for medical devices. I'm not going to talk about that specific side of the business today. I'm going to cover the standardisation pieces. And in my role, I lead on the development and publication of consensus standards, which provide businesses and organisations with best practices to help them address particular market challenges. And the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare is currently a key focus area for us, and particularly where it falls within the remit of medical device regulations. So today I'm going to be addressing how standards ensure that medical AI solutions are deployed in a safe, secure and effective manner, but also how both professionals and the public will trust AI medical deployments going forward. So medical device regulations are put in place to protect the interests of patients and the public, and that's across a vast range of diagnostic and therapeutic products. This includes instances where software and artificial intelligence are used for medical purposes. And standards are widely used by both regulators and medical device manufacturers as a tool for demonstrating conformity to regulations. So this applies in the UK market, but also across the majority of overseas markets. And in the UK, we have a process called designation, which provides a very precise link between the criteria set out in a standard with the safety requirements that are set out in the regulations. Designated standards aren't mandatory, however they do provide manufacturers with a very practical way of demonstrating conformity. So overall, not just in the UK but globally, we see them heavily applied. And in a global context, many medical device regulators are working towards converging their principles around safety and performance. And as a result of this, the standardisation activities we undertake are almost entirely undertaken at an international scale rather than at a national level. So BSI's role really is to provide a UK perspective to this global standardisation programme, which is fairly mature and probably consists of around about 1,200 publications in total. Now, recent trends to develop and deploy artificial intelligence solutions in healthcare have challenged the traditional medical device regulatory thinking. And this is because AI can introduce new hazards and new risks, which we haven't really previously considered within the traditional regulatory frameworks and standards that exist. So examples of this could be where we need additional robustness to ensure the appropriate level of safety for AI as a medical device. Also relating to proper consideration of the human interpretability of artificial intelligence in healthcare. And then finally, the adaptive nature of algorithms and how this aligns to the traditional change management processes that we have for medical technologies. So over the last 4 years, BSI has been exploring these challenges, and we've been working very closely with the regulator, MHRA, in relation to this. When we first started talking, MHRA recognised the need for a modified framework that would address the safety of artificial intelligence as a medical device. And they also considered that global standardisation would be a fundamental component for supporting this. So BSI created a joint initiative. We did this with MHRA, but also with some US counterparts, so the US FDA and a standards organisation, to research the standards need in relation to AI deployment in healthcare. And this has included some mapping activities around existing artificial intelligence challenges to the regulatory safety and performance principles within regulations. And in some instances, we've developed some new standards where we perceive that gaps existed. And just one quick example of this is in the area of risk management for medical AI. So there was already an established global standard that sets out the risk management process for manufacturers, heavily used across the globe by medical device manufacturers. And it identifies hazardous situations that can occur through intended use, but also foreseen misuse for any device. We convened a group made up of UK and US experts, both from a medical device background and also from an artificial intelligence background, to develop some new guidelines. And these address the application of risk management for artificial intelligence and machine learning in a medical devices context. And it highlights some of the potential hazards that we haven't really considered in explicit detail before. So items such as data quality, bias within data, overtrust, and also the adaptive nature of algorithms that manufacturers really need to consider when they're placing a product on the market. This guidance is almost complete and it will publish in January 2023. And aligned to that, last month, MHRA published a roadmap for software and artificial intelligence medical device regulation as they develop their new UK regulations. And this has several touch points with standardisation throughout it, and we're going to be working very closely with them over the coming months to address these. MHRA's ambition is to be a global leading regulator, and so as they build their framework for software and artificial intelligence, they're making sure that they align with the thinking from other countries, in particular the US and Canada, but there are others they're working with as well. So my consideration for today would be, think about the role that standards can play in bringing artificial intelligence to the healthcare market safely, effectively, but also in a timely manner. Our purpose within BSI is to convene standards as rapidly as possible and as early as possible in the innovation cycle to make sure we've addressed these challenges. And I want to do this by bringing together expertise both from a medical devices background, but also from the generic artificial intelligence standardised principles that we're working on at the moment to ensure that there's an aligned approach and that we're not reinventing the wheel. And by doing this, I think we can really bring together innovation and regulatory thinking through state-of-the-art best practices. And in particular, I want to consider how we do this in an international context as well. So in line with the MHRA strategy and also the ambitions that have been set out in the UK Life Science Vision. So basically, to sum up, I'd just like to say, as the UK national standards body, BSI has already taken steps to support this space, and we will continue working with key UK and global stakeholders going forward. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Rob. That sounds pretty much like good news. Altogether, but there are sort of few questions there. I mean, you obviously talk about data quality, which must be, front of mind in many ways when you're talking about AI standards and so on. I mean, you've got contact with the MHRA? It's really a question of who your other stakeholders are. Is the ICO one of the stakeholders that you work with as well? Because obviously that's important. Is NHS England part of your stakeholder community? I mean, how broadly do you draw and obviously you've got US and Canadian people that you work with, regulators and so on. Does that include the EU as well? I mean, how broadly do you draw your sort of stakeholder circle?
Yes, so MHRA, I would say, would be the key stakeholder for all of this. But within the standards development process and the committees and the organisations we engage with, we have to work much more broader than that. So we're looking at building consensus across the entire UK. So yes, NHS England, NICE, ICO, certainly in terms of the generic piece around artificial intelligence, are all organisations that I say were heavily involved in these conversations. The EU question is very interesting. So post-Brexit, BSI has remained a member of the European standardisation system. So we still provide input into their standards programme and we adopt the standards coming out. To some degree, we still have to do that because of the situation in Northern Ireland. So they have adopted the European regulations at the moment. So from a UK perspective, we're actually working to two separate sets of regulations when it comes to
And we don't want our developers to fall foul of the AIA when it goes through in Europe, do we? We want to make sure that we at least harmonise to a degree so that we can we can sell product from the UK into Europe, presumably.
That's correct. So convergence is the piece here, and anything we can do to bring a sort of international context to this work, I think is really important.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. And now over to Keith Errey, who's the CEO and co-founder of Isansys, if I got it right, Lifecare.
Yeah. Good evening. Thank you. We are Isansys.
Isansys.
Lifecare Limited. I'm by background a physicist. I've got degrees from the University of New South Wales and Oxford, and for the last 30 years been doing entrepreneurial kind of stuff. In the last 20, been putting wearable technology onto patients. And so wearable tech for me is something that's been around for a long, long time. And all during that time, I've been trying to get the wearable technology into the healthcare system so that the benefits of wireless wearable technology and connected systems can accrue to all the patients. And yes, it is difficult in the UK for all the reasons that we could go into. We're a small company, but do have global reach. And our best customers, not surprisingly, are outside of the UK. More surprisingly, in India, where we have made it affordable to do what I'll tell you about in a moment. But what I really want to talk about is what we would call real-time AI. And real-time AI is something that is about collecting data and processing it in real time. And we do that within our technology, which is a platform for collecting multiple vital sign, i.e. physiological data from patients in any location, in a hospital, in a home setting, somewhere in between. And so this, in terms of the NHS, what it does is collect this information and produce News 2 scores, among other things. So News 2, if people are unfamiliar with that, is what's called an early warning score. And an early warning score, as the name suggests, gives an indication that a patient may be heading towards a period where, or a point where they might deteriorate. What AI can do is vastly improve the performance of early warning scores. So what we actually do in Isansys, we produce the data, the very, very good data that we've been hearing about as the missing link for AI. And what we can talk about this in various ways, but we in fact connect a patient into the digital fabric or the digital infrastructure. And in doing that, what we do is create a very rich, a dynamic digital image of the patient, which in the first instance can live in an electronic medical record, but usually far too much information for a standard EMR system. And some people would call this a digital twin. So, in other words, what do I look like if I was digitized? What does the other Keith look like if he was digitized? Very different to me. And so, because we have this dynamic information there as well, and we have all the vital signs plus other things, and it is continuous, and it is wireless, then it's universal. So, what happens from this? Well, three things are really important. One, and initially, it's a remote patient monitoring system, or an inpatient monitoring system. Why is that interesting? Well, because we can create with clinical partners virtual wards. And the virtual wards we are talking about are acute care being able to be delivered outside the hospital. And we can do that in 1 or 2 days. I'm not talking about stuff that doesn't exist. I'm talking about a platform which, thanks to our notified body, is a Class 2A medical device under the MDR and under the UKCA regime. So that's the first thing. And that gives real-time information to care teams so that they know what is happening to patients. The second thing this does is automate one of the most basic processes in healthcare, which is what is happening to the patients. And this is what nurses do. So this is hugely efficient in being able to free nursing time. The third thing it does, more relevant to today, is produce the best data, continuous high-quality data sets of patients in any location, not strapped down in an intensive care ward where most of the continuous data comes from, but anywhere. So we are moving into a new world where this is the way things are going to happen. And 3 examples of this, good examples. One, something called the Rapid Index. This was work we did with Birmingham Women's and Children's Hospital way back, 2016 this was done. And what this did was take over 100,000 hours of training data from nearly 1,000 children, and from that, a new tool, a personalised, self-learning, early warning score for each and every patient, so we're talking personalised medicine, was developed. So, first phase of that work has been completed. It's been shown retrospectively to perform significantly better than the paediatric early warning scores. The next phase of this is a prospective study to try to get it into standard care. It's a no-brainer, but can we get that funded in the UK? I'm sorry, not. The second thing, another predictive algorithm is developed by our clinical users, our customers in Denmark. So they have developed, using information coming from our platform, they have developed a very accurate predictive score, real-time data being processed in real time for post-operative patients. These patients are out of an operating theatre. There isn't time to go and mine a record, an EMR. So this is real-time data. So a very nice one. Third one then, a group of things are around using the same data to predict things like deterioration status of patients with advanced liver disease, cardiac problems, and so on. Because once you get this data, you can apply the AI to it. And it's the same data in a sense. It depends how it's cut and sliced. That depends on the patient's conditions. So all of this is coming together. And I think, what I'd really ask for from this evening is that what we're talking about is high resolution surveillance of patients. And if it's put like that, it suddenly sounds a lot more sinister. And so what we do need is to make sure that these kinds of data are never misused, so that they are not used for state surveillance, as they may be in some countries. We hear things like this happening in China. And that they are not used to sell or refuse services to anyone. And I don't quite know how that's dealt with through what can be done here, but that is so important, because if we lose that trust, and we've heard this earlier, then patients will not consent to this kind of thing, which will make such a difference to healthcare providers everywhere. And I think, finally then, I think what Keith was talking about earlier, as a point I put down here, is really interesting. Use the AI to protect the data. Use AI to protect the data itself, because that will be incredibly important for any use of this in the future. And I'm sorry, I probably overran a little bit.
That's great. Thanks very much. Bang on the dot there, Keith. Why not the UK, and why India? India, because we are dealing at the moment with the
the private hospital network. But the private hospital network in India is accessing patient population about the size of Europe, 300 million or so. And all the hospital groups that we are talking to, whose names are probably well known, are very interested in being able to use the data with the real-time data to this kind of holy grail thing, get the data from the EMR, get the real-time data, mash it up in real time, and you have something really, really powerful as decision support for the care teams.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Now I'm going to start and just ask our parliamentarians who are present here whether they want to follow up anything, and then I'm going to throw it open and take, say, 3 questions and then go through until we get to the witching hour of 7 o'clock. Robin, are you wanting to follow up?
Yeah, but first of all, thank you for the 6 incredibly good presentations, and I'm sadly missed most of the first one, but I'm sure it was brilliant. And my question is probably coming your way, and it picks up on something that Keith and Natalie said, which is accessibility of NHS data. It ought to be something of huge importance to this country, and we've heard there are issues around, I think, Keith, you were talking about fragmentation, etc., and indeed cost. What are we doing about that? Sorry.
Not quite yet. I'm going to come to Chris. Chris.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Lord Holmes, by the way. Yeah.
It's okay, Tim. Great presentation. And to answer your question right at the top of the meeting, Tim, as ever, positive. How could it be any other with you in the chair? But it seems that the theme that's been running through it for me, and unsurprisingly, is this whole sense of data, obvious in AI, but in this context, NHS data. And is the biggest hurdle with all of this the reality that there is, if you will, in so many ways, no such thing as NHS data, and that is the biggest hurdle. And Keith's presentation, I think, was superb in a sense of if you can cut through, motorway over, go through that and build from beginning. Is that one of the key ways to approach this and not have that constant problem of having to try and blend new stuff with legacy systems and all of that? Is that mashed up, mixed up, and crazy enough question for you, Tim? Good, thanks very much.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you and Robin are very much on the same page, and it's Dom who's in the hot seat, I think.
Make sure I've got the corporate lines right. So
you've got some pretty good notes there.
These are the red lines.
Hold up your amazing table there.
So this is a table of 30-odd projects that we currently fund that have outcomes in various areas, from radiology to pathology to ophthalmology, where we're trialing these technologies. If you rewind back 2018, 2019, AI was promising, but we didn't know whether the evidence was there. And you've seen this kind of polarization in the conversation we've had. We need more data, but we also need to prove that it's safe enough because we're introducing more standards. But which one is it? Like, where's the threshold? And I think there's a separate piece we should probably pick up if we've got time, which is what's our risk-based appetite for addressing the fundamental needs we need as the NHS to use these technologies with the right safeguards around it to deploy these things in the real world as of today. So we'll probably pick that up separately. But to answer the exam question around data, we have multiple volumes of large data sets available for research purposes. You mentioned CPRD, there's the HDR UK program, there's obviously people here from Optum Research, Cancer Research Program, with one of the largest mammography data sets that I am aware of, where it's got longitudinal data sets you can train breast cancer algorithms on. And then as a government, what we're also doing is 2 large programs of work. One that you'll be familiar with, it's just been announced, called the Federated Data Platform, which is around operational use of NHS data to support us in kind of doing that risk stratification and understanding what's happening in our population. And then separately to that, another program of work in partnership with BAYS, looking at data for R&D. So how do we provide those secure data environments at scale for those specific modalities so that people can access them securely in the right mechanisms, so that we can provide the right commercial incentives to train the algorithms. And I think this goes back to what I said earlier. We're all really good at building those data sets for training. The challenge then is, putting it into the clinical practice so it's at scale. And I would like to reframe it back to the data is absolutely important. Governments is doing that, there's investment in it, but we should also in parallel make sure we've got the right mechanisms so that Natalie and others can make sure that when they're building out their products, they're not going to other countries because they can't get the actual scalability in the country and they're doing it in 5 hospitals.
You've asked the question, what now needs to happen?
Well, we need to continue the investment into research databases, the data for R&D program, and then separately as a program, we're looking at what is the mechanisms that we can support the actual deployment of models back in to the clinical pathway. Now, we're doing that through clinical trials, but I think there's another mechanism that we should think through, which is how do we provide the safeguards so that we can use these diagnostic tools, working with the clinicians to make sure that they are providing real-world results, and we're providing the safeguards that the actual technology works rather than doing a 3-year clinical trial. These are 3 to 5 years pieces of work, and if we're talking about, like I'm talking here, like Aidence, we started out in 2019. We're seeing a report going to be published in March 2023. The promising versus what we're doing versus the evidence generation. We have a little bit of work to do in managing our risk appetite in terms of what we want to see realized today.
And I mean, the Digital Transformation Directorate, that's all. I mean, does all this reside now at NHS England, and all this needs to be delivered by NHS England, or rather other actors? I mean, you know, if you're one of our participants in our panel, do we still make sure that everything is directed to NHS England centrally, or are there other mechanisms that apply?
The department and NHS England are working on the policy mechanisms to how do we do this. So how do we do this safely and appropriately, which is what the lab was set up to do. And then we work with all the different agencies. So on the regulatory front, the NHS AI lab in the early days, what we've done is we've funded the regulatory agencies to try and streamline some of those components. So some of those early frictions that we knew in 2017, 2018, the acronym soup of all the agencies. How do you as an innovator know what agency you need to engage with? From the Information Commissioner's Office, from NICE, the MHRA, CQC, HRA. I'm not going to stress test anybody here if you know what all those agencies do, but we funded a program of work that's in private beta now, which is looking at a multi-agency advice service to support the innovators and also us as commissioners to understand the processes of what's the type of evidence generation that you need to do to get to market, working with obviously notified bodies that are doing more standards work that's harmonizing internationally. But in the first instance, can we clarify the process? So maybe I'm not hopefully speaking out of turn, but the conversations that I've had with many innovators is not necessarily they don't want to generate the evidence, they just want to know how much evidence is appropriate and what's the mechanisms they need to do to get there so they can timeline it appropriately, rather than have to jump through more and more hurdles of more and more agencies.
I think you've trailed a very decent coat there, if I may say so. This multi-agency advice service sounds to me as though it's a really interesting development. Where would that sit?
So it's currently led by NICE as the lead agency. But it works with CQC, HRA, MHRA, and I'm going to test all my acronyms.
With alphabet soup, basically.
Yeah. And the idea is to be a single point of contact to help innovators, but also commissioners, understand what the requirements are for what technologies look like. We started this in the pandemic. We had every technology coming to us saying, if you could only deploy us in the Nightingales, we could solve all your problems. When we said, okay, we'll go and test those technologies, most of those companies disappeared quite quickly when we wanted to go and test them on independent data sets. So we set out something called the AI Buyer's Guide, and it was the first attempt to trying to streamline the conversation as to what's required from you from GDPR right through to medical device regulations. Because I say this with lots of love, many people would struggle to know what the notified body does versus what the MHRA does versus what NICE does, etc.
No, it's as clear as anything. Yeah. Excellent. Well, that is, so what we need to do is have some carefully positioned parliamentary questions about when is this multi-agency advice service going to take root and take off and all this kind of thing, just to keep the wheels turning as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
So we're in live. My colleagues are in the back. Jen, it's in private beta now. Yeah. It's in
private beta.
Yeah.
When does it go public beta, or
end of the year, as I understand it? Yeah.
Fantastic. And it'll sit in the department, or
it'll be led by NICE. So
it'll be led by NICE.
Yeah. Obviously funded by the department.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting development in that case. Thanks very much. I'm going to throw open to the audience now, and just let's have 3 questions. Christian.
My name is Christian de Watervan, and I'm the head of a consultancy called Projectis. Michael, you talked about practical uses of AI, and Keith, you talked about early warning scores. Unless I'm mistaken, I haven't heard about AI being used to detect cancer. Would you have any information about this? But my question is what I have in mind is that I'm a very good friend of Dr. James Redding, who works in University College, and apparently he has seemingly discovered a way to detect cancer through the immune system and just got a national grant and is about to file a patent. We're going to have lunch very soon, and I don't remember James mentioning AI to me. What could I say to him if he asked me what AI can do for cancer detection? Do you have any information about this? You could share.
Christian, that's our first question. Second question, and then third.
Yeah. I'm CEO of Catalyst Technology. We're a blockchain company. We work in bringing wearable information into a patient wallet and communicating across the blockchain for the AI federated learning. The key thing, when we built our business, the focus was the 10-year plan, the NHS, which we read in 2018. And we worked with a private clinic in Barcelona to build this whole system, which basically tackles the things which, Mr. Turpin was talking about in terms of the regulating the whole AI life cycle, if you will. But the way we did this, and the key word in the NHS 10-year plan was patient empowerment, where who owns this data and who's got control of the data. So this is why we created the patient wallet. And yet, this patient empowerment doesn't seem to be a priority, and I've never seen it implemented. I'm not an expert across the whole field, so I don't intend to be disrespectful. But I want to pick up on your point. You're in the wearable business. But the typical pathway for patient data from a wearable device is back to the wearable device creator, and the software runs in their centralized server. So they become the owner of that data, if you will, on behalf of that patient. And then they share and integrate with everything else. And the sharing and integration piece is why we've got all these problems, these patched problems, which we've got lots and lots of people in lots and lots of meaningful ways trying to make this work. But actually this patched system, which is stopping these fragmented data sources coming together to give you a holistic picture of the patient in order such that you can actually evaluate the full cost of that patient over their lifetime and potentially align another cost to it. So it's a bit of a speech, but I'm missing, I think it's the elephant in the room, is where this data is actually held, how it's owned, and how it's permissioned, and therefore how it's accessed.
Great, thanks very much. Number 3, I've got one there, and I'll come back to you later. And have I got other questions at the back of the room? Because I want to make sure we get a proper gender balance, actually, which we haven't got at the moment. Number 3.
Alec Robertson, a citizen. As a citizen, I don't feel comfortable about anybody owning data on me. And following on from your question, I understand that the owner of a database owns the data. Is it possible for a citizen to own a database and the AI to be a broker for their data to whoever wants to use that data?
Is that a question to me?
It could be.
First of all, I'm not a technology person myself, but the data, when the patient hosts the data, they could have their data hosted by their GP. But what the difference is the GP hosts a wallet on their behalf, but the patient hosts the keys. And once the patient's got the keys, they can share it with research, they can share it with regulators, they can share. So you get access to the full picture of that patient.
We've got that picture. Did you want to come back on this?
I just like the idea that somebody brought up about AI being used to protect the data.
Fantastic. That's great. Well, let's take a third question then. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Said Sharif, consultant in AI and medical technology. Just a quick point. As you know, the public trust for the AI-based system is extremely important. So following the points that Keith mentioned, how do you think the data availability can affect this trust, and especially to show the efficiency of the AI algorithms, which is extremely important because we do need to gain the public trust?
Great. So who would like to kick off? I'm not going to ask Dom to start. But I'm going to just ask our panel to come along. Yes, Keith.
Just a very quick response to that question. What we don't do is take the data. We take our back-end system as a so-called virtual machine, and we put it into the health provider's own IT infrastructure, so the data goes straight into the electronic record. That doesn't actually answer the question exactly of who owns the data, but we certainly don't try to take it out. And because we don't do that, we have been very much more successful with a number of hospital groups and those other wearable companies who take the data and do something with it and then give it back.
And that's partly an answer to the trust issue, isn't it? If you know that your data is secure. Any other members of the panel want to answer, particularly on the cancer detection
I'd like
aspect?
to make a response on that. Yeah. So,
and then I think, Natalie, you want to come.
Yeah. So, I mean, cancer detection, I mean, there are obvious examples of image detection being used for smear tests and other examples where AI can actually, over time, outperform humans at analyzing scans and images like that. But that is really kind of a function of a specific cancer, a specific step in the diagnostic process. There's an overarching theme with the AI use for longitudinal health records at scale, when we're able to monitor patients, hundreds of millions of patients potentially over decades, see combining information, omic information, genomic information, as well as their treatments, their pharmaceuticals that they've been on, all of that combined data. And we're not yet at the point where we have large enough data sets to show what effect that could have. Some of the early results we have on that suggest that there's a huge potential there for detecting earlier signs of cancer or highlighting people that are a higher risk of detecting cancers. So while your consultant friend may not yet have this evidence in hand, it's something that we're building and it's something that we'd like to work on.
Great. Yes. Oh, sorry, Natalie, and then the other Keith. Yes.
I can pick up just a quick point about the cancer AI. So at MedAdvice, we also did build algorithms for cancer progression. So not specifically cancer detection, but actually how to understand which patients were more likely to progress, which patients were more likely to respond to specific therapies, particularly more aggressive therapies and more expensive therapies that you might not necessarily want to offer to everybody right away at the early stages, but some patients, there are certain cohorts that you can pick up using some of the advanced analytics and algorithms that those patients would benefit earlier from more aggressive treatments and should be put on those treatments sooner so that they have a better outcome at the other end. So these are some of the things that I think also are worth considering in terms of cancer AI. I did want to pick up the point around the data, trust, and also blockchain. This isn't a blockchain panel, but I think it's a really important technology, and I think it's important for us to understand that decentralized computing, federated computing, and federated learning, these technologies are out there which enable public trust in the movement of data. The technologies are available to be able to build this kind of infrastructure. And so for us, it's really important to think about who's going to build these technologies, where is the capability going to come from, and can we actually develop these kinds of systems that will allow this kind of data movement and breaking down some of these data barriers and silos that we have observed over the years.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Keith.
Yeah, and so as an answer to the cancer detection question, I was very much actually, when Michael, you were talking about where you use AI, your eye gets very quickly drawn towards the very exciting stuff, AI reading mammograms and so on and so forth. But much of the benefit is probably behind the scenes. It's in automating and scaling and reducing variation in the administrative aspect side of things. So I just wanted to flag that AI has a really important role to play in a number of different places. For example, who's missing the screening? Who's less likely to follow up on their screening so we can identify them and reach out to them? Who's at the greatest risk in terms of, outside the sort of standard screening methods? Who should we be speaking to? And then when it comes to assisting doctors treating patients or nurses treating patients or patients collecting data, what questions should be asked? Because under pressure, sometimes the right questions aren't asked, sometimes the flags aren't picked up within the record. So I'd also encourage that people consider AI being used on the less, show front type thing. You know, the behind the scenes, that's where I think a lot of the benefits can happen.
Yeah, for detection, do you combine AI and statistics?
I'm going to bring you in. Yeah.
Do you? Yeah, sorry.
No, carry on, Christian.
It just another thing pops up to my mind. In the 80s, 90s, the California police used to park a car at a certain date at the end of the month when they knew salary would be paid to workers, and they would park the car in one place, one part of a hot spot in Los Angeles. And basically, because they were using statistics, they could predict that the crime would be made at such time, such hour, and such place. Do you think we could get to the same point with cancer, where with enough data, we could sort of predict and tell the patient before anything starts?
I'm not in this public environment. I'm not going to commit to that. But it's very tempting. But there's actually something else in what you said as well, is that we don't have to use the biggest, shiniest tool in the toolbox here. You know, if simple logistic regression, if some statistics does this, then that's fine.
To the practical application.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask Dom if there's any, in his list of pilots, whether there's anything to do with this, and also your approach to data, because this is the besetting issue. I mean, you know, we know there's a big contract out at the moment, potentially. We know there have been issues to do with GP data sets, etc., etc. So give us a snapshot.
So first off, on the cancer piece, it would be wrong of me not to include the work that NHS England's doing to fund a £200,000, that's cheap, 200,000 patient trial for doing blood tests to test 50 cancers using Grail. It's probably worth putting that as a note. On data, look, as data-driven technologies, data saves lives. We know that harnessing the data is going to be really important. Having that trust is going to be key to it. And there are multiple ways to do that. Government published the Data Saves Lives strategy early on this year, looking at how do we build the right mechanisms to do that. And out of that, the key thing that really hit home for me in terms of what we should be doing more of, and there's a program of work led by a bunch of officials looking at engaging and already engaging on kind of implementation of the data strategy, is how do we have a better public conversation? How do we involve the various stakeholders in specifically that? From the work that we've done in the NHS AI lab, we've got a report commissioned by us, but written up by Ipsos Mori and others, looking at the exam question around like the use of personal data stores and what's the appetite for this. And I'm just kind of trailing that will be published hopefully in the next couple of weeks. I don't know what else to cover really, other than I think there's quite a lot in flight already.
So you have a separate website, so in 2 weeks' time we can all
so you can
hook up
do a search for NHS AI Lab and you'll find the information.
Great, because I think there's quite a lot of people around the table who'd like just to make sure that we keep abreast of the latest guidance and what you're up to. Right, I think 3 quick questions we've got time for. So I think I've got not very diverse, so to speak. I've got 1, 2, 3. I'm afraid that's going to have to be it. So first gentleman in the middle, then another gentleman, then a lady there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mark Canning-Brown. I'm a consulting clinical scientist in the NHS. And my group's involved with evaluating AI tools. And we've evaluated a lot of AI tools, and I echo lots said here that lots are very positive. But I'd also like to posit that there's also lots of negatives. We've evaluated AI tools that are CE marked, FDA approved, but did not perform very well in an independent, large-scale representative data set. So I wonder what the group's opinion are of the need for any independent evidence outside of the CE marking FDA style evidence that's presented.
Really good question. Thank you. Number 2.
Yeah. My question is about the access to these data sets. Once they are anonymized, how do we ensure level playing field between the startups, which are innovating products and services, and established organizations, so that it doesn't become like so much red tape that the startups cannot actually get access to the data sets required to innovate in this area?
Thank you. That's number 2. And then number 3.
Disclosure, I work for the Multi-Agency Advisory Service, and I'm looking at the policy involved in all of this, and I'm just interested in the conversations focus primarily on data. And linking back to your question, one other area that we need to consider is about the governance post-deployment of these tools, and particularly with the growing field of AI assurance and auditing. And I'm just very interested to hear from particularly innovators how they are thinking about how they're going to approach that, not just in developing their systems so they're auditable for procurement, but also post-deployment, how they can manage re-auditing processes, because that can have cost implications for all. It's developing field, it's not there yet, so.
Thank you very much. Well, what I'm going to do is the panel can decide whether or not to answer the questions, but I'm going to ask them to reflect just in a couple of sentences each before we reach the witching hour of 7 o'clock. So, Keith, why don't we start with you?
We've covered an awful lot. It's difficult to reflect on it all, but I also appreciate there's some questions out there.
We always ask the impossible, I'm afraid.
Well, I shall attempt to deliver. So first of all, in terms of the ability to, we talk about all the great positives, but there's also potential negatives. I'm a potential person that will be treated by AI-powered, data-driven technologies, my mum, my family, and everything. So I want to make sure that it works well too. I'm very supportive of developing, independent ways of assessing this and finding a way. In fact, there was a recent paper on the use of symptom checkers where they talked about how we might be able to standardize the use of patient vignettes in that particular case and standardizing approaches, because we at Babylon and other areas as well have published papers on this, but there's some variation in how it's approached. So I think standardizing approaches can be really helpful. I'd be supportive of that. Access to data sets, of course, I love it. There's big organizations, small organizations, but we want to make sure that creativity isn't all concentrated at the top. It's distributed wherever as well. So I'm really supportive of that and making access to the data. The point that I was going to say is that it's great to give access to data for the machines to learn to help people, but it's also good if we give the clinicians access to the data and the patients access to the data in a safe way as well. And it'd be very nice if we could harmonize this too.
I think that's it. Thank you. That's good. Rob.
Thank you. So I'll pick up on that first question relating to evaluation of AI tools and negative examples where CE marked products aren't performing well. I think this is an area we're trying to explore through standardization. So the key hat I wear is to provide and develop standards that support regulations. But we're also looking at this from a broader perspective. So what are all the criteria that a manufacturer or developer should look at when looking to place a product on the market? So there are regulatory requirements, but there are also procurement requirements as well. And I think it's about informing the public of that in terms of the evidence they need to build beyond just that regulatory process in order to provide a decent product into the market. So we have a developing standard at the moment, which I think is broadly aimed at covering that wider piece, going beyond the regulation, which I think would help solve the problem that you're referring to. And then just briefly on the multi-agency advice service, great idea, bringing everything together under one area to provide advice around artificial intelligence. I've had some conversations around this, around how we bring standardization in and almost the plethora of standards of where do you go. So for me, this is very much about how do we create a front door for developers so that we can showcase this, the entry point for some of this.
And startups and, in answer to that question too, to some degree. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Dom.
A couple of things I'll say. I think the questions will be answered. We have a flourishing AI marketplace. We have a lot of questions. We're into a whole bunch of academic standards, international regulations. All the things that we really want to make sure that we're doing is supporting how those companies develop the evidence appropriately so that we can get them into the hands of the clinicians. I think we're at a time, fortunately and unfortunately, that we really need to start thinking about how we're using the appropriate technology to support us deliver the healthcare that we desperately need for this country. And I think in that, providing in flight the frameworks and the standards and the assurances that we needed, whether it's building on the additional work of the MHRA and the work that they've got mapped out for us in terms of software as a medical device, including artificial intelligence, right to what does the commissioning structures for the National Health Service look like if we were to buy a breast screening AI technology that can save 25% of clinicians' time. And I think there's still quite a lot of work to do, but it's quite nice to see this happening in parallel.
Fantastic. We know you've got all the answers, Tom. Okay, Natalie.
Yeah, sure. I'd just like to pick up the question around the external validation. I think it's so vital to have external validation from clinicians, multiple clinical groups for any technologies that innovators, startups build. What I've seen is that there's real challenge in getting access to these clinician groups. I think it would be really beneficial if, one, there was more of them, two, they were more incentivized, and three, they were more visible to startups, to really understand who to go to and how to get access to that kind of external validation. And I think we have a real risk right now in the healthcare system that there is no time and no headspace for clinicians to be able to do this work. APPG just published a report to say there's been a 44% decline in clinical trials done in the UK over the last 5 years. And that they're considering this an existential risk to the healthcare system innovation. And if we're not careful and we don't do enough, we can risk the same in technology development and AI. And this is why there needs to absolutely be funding and incentives put towards that kind of external validation.
Thanks, Natalie. We've picked up some reading matter, I think, during the course of this gathering, haven't we? So the APPG report is also sounds something we need to get our heads round as well. And then Keith, Errey.
Yeah, so on the question of the external validation, I think what you need to do is publish those results. Certainly our notified body, which is BSI, would not allow a post-market report not to include something like that, and therefore it would be challenged in the ongoing surveillance audits. And certainly the MDR generally is anti-competitive or anti-innovative, but certainly at that level where there is an insistence on post-market surveillance, then it's quite powerful, and that is the way to be able to do it.
Thanks very much, Keith. And last word to Michael Bridges.
Very briefly. I mean, independent validation, obviously very important, but as I said earlier, there are processes already in place in the healthcare domain for like peer review, for statistical rigor, for tests and new tests to be put through the gauntlet, and so we would want to use those processes. And very finally, I think we've heard a lot about some of the very advanced and very shiny new AI that we could apply. Let's not overlook the more practical uses of AI here that are being actioned right now and that can make a difference to cancer patients over the next 5 and 10 years because we're better documenting their treatments, because we're better being able to engage with them.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Well, a big thank you to our panel. We've cantered round the course today, but we've covered really a lot of issues, I think, in a very short space of time. Really interesting in terms of the applications of AI, but also the implications in terms of certification, standards, data, trust, a whole range of issues which in a sense are more acute when it comes to healthcare than probably any other application of artificial intelligence. So to that extent, we're really working at the most sensitive sort of interface, so to speak, with members of the public, and of course when you've also got a very large number of staff who you're expecting to understand the issues in terms of the NHS workforce, then that is another consideration itself. A big thank you to our panel. Would you join me in applauding? And as ever, eventually, on Pavilion, I think that there will be a write-up of this. No pressure, George. There'll be a write-up of the issues as they were appeared. And if you want to try and buttonhole a member of the panel because you didn't get your question in, then please do if you can grab them before they get out of the door. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. And thanks for coming today.
Very fascinating.
Thank you very much.